Welcome back to History on a Hog. I'm Cap'n Boz. As we saw at the conclusion of Part 6, Militia General Andrew Jackson had won a decisive victory against the rebellious Red Stick Creeks at Horseshoe Bend, and the American victory simultaneously signaled the end of the Red Stick Uprising and the Creek Civil War. The Red Sticks had been thoroughly defeated, and they ceased being a hostile threat after Horseshoe Bend. The South was now safe for an expansion of American frontier settlements. It was now time to focus on the British.
This very competently and decisive campaign led by Andrew Jackson during the Creek War led to Jackson's recognition by President Madison's administration, and as a reward for his success, he was given a regular commission in the United States Army and placed in command of the 7th Military District, the area that covered the South. Obviously, this was a very big step up for him from being a state militia major general.
Remarkable. I can't stress enough about how unprecedented this was. You just don't make someone an instant regular Army general out of a militia commander. And he was a civilian to boot. It had only been done during the Revolutionary War when the Continental Congress created the U.S. Army out of the various militias, and they needed instant generals to lead it. But it had not been done since then. But the president was also sending a message to his senior Army officers. Jackson won battles, and his generals did not. The message would eventually have the desired effect of lighting a fire under their butts.
And the territory in which he would be responsible for its defense would include Louisiana, Tennessee, and the Mississippi Territory, which today is made up of both Mississippi and Alabama. With the ink on his commission still wet, Jackson set off immediately for Mobile, where he would set up his new headquarters.
And there was little time to waste. While he was en route to Mobile, Jackson sent out several military scouts to locate the source of the weapons and gunpowder that the Red Stick Creeks had in their possession at Horseshoe Bend. In the aftermath of the battle, the Americans were able to confirm that the Red Sticks had been using some of the latest and most up-to-date military muskets of the time, both British and Spanish muskets. But to Jackson, it was obvious where the muskets were coming from. They were coming from Pensacola, in Spanish Florida. So Jackson decided he needed to get some intel on the port facilities of Pensacola and see if his hunch was right.
And because of the delicacy and complication of sending an American soldier into Florida and crossing an international border with Spain, a country that the United States was not at war with, Jackson would need to send someone he could trust. So he would send one of his most capable and trusted officers, Tennessee Militia Captain John Gordon. His mission? To cross into Spanish Florida, recon Pensacola and the port facilities, and report back what he had observed. In particular, Jackson wanted to know if the British were using the port facilities of Pensacola as a military supply base, where they could launch attacks against the United States.
With great effort, the scouting party worked their way through miles of thick woods and swampy areas. Remember, there were no roads in this area at this time. After several days, Captain Gordon and his team arrived at Pensacola, only to find the Union Jack flying from both of the military forts that protected the port. And more significantly, they personally observed British officers training and arming Creek and Seminole warriors with the modern muskets. Jackson's hunch had been right. The British were in Pensacola and arming Indians. The other significant finding was the confirmation of Spanish complicity with the British and the Indians. Lastly, Captain Gordon and his team gained valuable information about the two Spanish fortifications in Pensacola, which would prove to be invaluable later on. He returned to report his findings directly to General Jackson in Mobile. But Gordon's report did more than just report the British presence in Pensacola. It also exposed the overall British military intentions and strategy. Based upon the British activity being observed in Pensacola, it became clear that the British were shifting their focus from the North and Chesapeake Bay areas to the South, where the British perceived the Americans to be militarily weak. Simply put, the British plan for the South was to invade and control the American southern territories, and then work their way north along the Mississippi River, cutting off America in the west.
This is why the Southern campaign in the War of 1812 was so significant. If Jackson had failed, the British would have won the war. And so, to disrupt the British plan, Jackson would have to start by capturing Pensacola, which lay in Spanish Florida. But the United States was not at war with Spain. So by attacking Pensacola, Jackson would be committing an act of war against Spain. But it had to be done. It was a huge gamble for Jackson. But gamble he would, and he knew the stakes would be high, because he realized that an attack on Pensacola would be seen as an invasion of Spain, and his actions could draw Spain into the war against the United States, the last thing the U.S. government wanted to see happen. But in Jackson's assessment, the attack upon Pensacola had to be done in order to disrupt the British war plan.
It was obvious to Jackson that the focal point of the British plan was to go after the real high-value target of the South, the city of New Orleans. If the British seized New Orleans, they could control commerce along the entire Mississippi River, and they would directly threaten the entire American western border. In fact, they might be able to link up with British forces up in the Great Lakes. And with the already established Royal Naval blockade of American ports from the Great Lakes to Maine and along the Atlantic shoreline down to Georgia, the British could completely surround the United States. The naval blockade had already been in place along the Atlantic seaboard since the war started in 1812, and it was working. It was preventing American international maritime trade from taking place, and had already had a serious negative effect on the American economy. New Orleans was the only large port left that wasn't blockaded. If the British were to succeed in seizing New Orleans and cutting off Mississippi River commerce, then the British could force America to go broke. And a financially bankrupt America would put Great Britain at a great advantage to dictate terms at the peace treaty negotiations that were already taking place. So the capture of New Orleans would be critical in their war plans. And in 1814, the city of New Orleans was completely undefended and highly vulnerable to British attack. And the British knew it. They were already making preparations to assault New Orleans, figuring it would be a piece of cake. In fact, they were already gathering intelligence on the city and had entered into discussions with the Louisiana swamp rat, Jean Lafitte, to help them with the invasion of the city. By the way, he did not side with the British, but side with his true allegiance, America. But in order to take New Orleans, the British would need another southern port to logistically support their military operations. And the only other major port in the South, other than Pensacola, that had large enough port facilities and was vulnerable to a British assault, was the port of Mobile. If the British established an operational base in Mobile, they could easily assemble enough troops to attack New Orleans using an overland route. So once again, Mobile would be the focal point of military strategy in the South. And Jackson surmised this. In response, he would devise a clever defensive plan to deny the British. When you come back for Part 8, learn about General Jackson's defensive strategy in opposing the British in the South, and see what he has in store for Pensacola and Mobile. Does Jackson have the audacity to invade Spanish Florida? Find out next time on History on a Hawk.